I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Ehrlich.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable.
This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. This is, would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
That's sort of like what feels like a lot of the history of democratic societies have looked like, right? Which is these sort of like clever rebellions of like, how are we gonna change this thing to make that thing better or whatever.
I like that, a clever rebellion. That's a good, I don't know if that's an actual term, but I like it. It should be an actual term.
Ooh, and I'll also tell you, well, actually, we can get into this. We already talked about too much stuff.
Well, yeah, we already talked about it. This is all this stuff.
Too much information already.
TMI. Cool. Well, should we get started?
Yeah, let's get started here.
Well, welcome to
Weichel?
golly.
Wow, what's going on?
It's like I was able to speak
okay?
for 15 minutes and now I can't talk.
Did you have a seizure?
I don't know. I hope not. Welcome to the Biographers podcast. I
Just
said
the
no
Biographers.
podcast. I know you say that, but it's welcome to the Biographers.
There we go.
Here we are. We're going to talk more about Abigail.
It is a podcast, technically. That is true. But the show is just called The Biographers.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the Biographers. Today we're going to talk more about Abigail Adams, founding mother of the country. We always say founding father is a founding mother of the country that we live in today.
And for those that don't live in the United States, she's a founding mother of the United States.
I don't know if anybody could be listening and think that you and I are from anywhere but the United States. But
okay, except for have you watched there's a show on Netflix, like a miniseries called Ripley?
No.
It's remember that Matt Damon movie from back in the day called The Talented Mr. Ripley?
Uh-huh.
So that was actually I learned recently a book series, and it's like a thriller series kind of a thing about this guy, whatever his first name is, Tom Ripley, that's what it is. So they made it into an actual mini series, and it is much, in my opinion, better than
nice.
the movie.
I'll take a look.
It's really, really good, really beautifully kind of shot. But there's this consistent joke throughout the entire movie that it's most of it is in Italy, is where it takes place.
Well, isn't that where the movie?
Yeah, exactly.
I know it was overseas. It was like beautiful.
Yeah, it's
beaches.
gorgeous,
Yeah.
and how it's filmed. I mean, I'm telling you, if you like film, it is just like, you're just soaking up the gorgeous shots. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But there's this consistent joke where, as the police are trying to like hunt down certain like mysteries and stuff that are happening, they'll ask a witness and they'll say like, who were these people? And almost every single time the person will go, just like normal white guys, American or English, I'm not sure.
Oh, so they don't necessarily
couldn't tell the
notice.
difference. It was like the accent to them was like, yeah, it was American or British. I'm not really. It was one of the two. So that was the first time that I had heard that. That I was like, oh, weird. Actual foreign languages probably will hear the English accent and the American accent as fairly similar to their ears.
Yeah, that does make sense.
It's like with us, if we heard a person from somewhere in Asia talking to us in an American accent, we probably wouldn't be able to discern.
Oh, you're Japanese or Chinese
or Vietnamese
or
Korean or whatever. At least most of them. I'm usually pretty good with Japanese, but a lot of times languages like Chinese and Vietnamese, I'm like, nope, I can't figure that out. So
interesting.
Yeah. So anyways, that was kind of cool.
I didn't ever think about that. I always think about how I can call out an Aussie. Or not like, I can notice an Aussie versus an English person. Anyway, whatever.
But Aussie versus Kiwi? That's a tough one. Subtle.
Yeah, it's very subtle. But anyway, speaking of other languages, the beginning of this episode is bonjour.
Bonjour. Oh, that's right, because she last time was left for Paris, right?
We pick up in Paris in 1784. To refresh your memory, Abigail and Nabby have sailed across the Atlantic to join John and John Quincy. They arrived in London. Abigail approved of London, especially the indoor plumbing. She liked that a lot. Mm-hmm. But then they headed across the English Channel to Paris, where they moved into a 50-room mansion, complete with gardens, servants, and a view of the River Seine.
Jeez.
Abigail did not like France as much as she had liked England, but over time she did kind of come around to it. Now, if you also recall, Nabby was engaged to Royal Tyler, an allegedly reformed womanizer, and heir to a fortune that he had mostly squandered. I'd say he had like about 30% left of what he was left. And now, granted, that 30% was still a lot of money, but like when you like look at someone who's probably in their 20s and they've wasted 2/3 of what they inherited, you're like, oh God, really? Sure. Well, despite his successful legal practice in Braintree, John had doubted Royal's reformation, I guess you could say. Although Royal had won Abigail's heart, she insisted that Nabby postpone the engagement for their trip abroad. So it was like, Nabby loved Royal, and then Abigail was like, I'm not so sure, and John was like, I'm definitely not sure, and then he was kind of like courting the mother, and then Abigail was like, you know, he's okay. But John was like, and then she said, you know what, we're going over there. Why don't we just put this on hold?
Okay.
It's a little like, maybe he's good, maybe he's bad. Let's put it on hold. Just
if he's serious, let him wait.
Yeah, exactly. Now, around this time, Nabby began to appreciate the French way of life, remarking, I've often complained of a stiffness and reserve in our circles in America that was disagreeable. A little French ease adopted would be an improvement. So she was like, actually, the French are kind of like, chill. I'm digging this. And at first she didn't like France either. So they're coming around. Despite this, Abigail didn't begin many friendships in Paris beyond a few American expats such as John Paul Jones, Thomas Jefferson, and some of John's other male French acquaintances. Male French.
Which, by the way, I know that John Paul Jones is a significant historical figure, but all I can ever think of is the bassist of Led Zeppelin. His name was John Paul Jones. Is he? I can't remember if he's still alive.
I didn't know that, but he was a Scottish-American naval captain who was a commander in the American Revolutionary War and was considered the father of the American Navy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I was like, I should know John Paul Jones. So I went over to his Wikipedia page and just put a little note on there just to be like, when we need to know who he was.
Good call.
Here we go. He was also a Freemason, which is kind of cool. A lot of them were Freemasons.
National treasure.
Yeah, he was friends with John Hancock and Benjamin Franklin. He was just another one of those guys.
One of the gang, one of the boys.
Yep. Well, okay, so in Paris, Abigail also got a pet bird to keep her company. It didn't have a name, though. I couldn't find the name of her bird. Maybe she should have gotten herself a dog, though, to walk, because she felt like she was getting a little fat.
Oh.
She said, we rise in the morning, not quite so early as I used to when I provided the turkeys and geese we used to feast on. So that's where I'm like, I think Abigail might have been going out and like breaking a neck or two in the mornings. But she had to feed them until they were ready.
She probably also wasn't used to the sheer volume of butter the French were throwing at her.
Let me get to that. I said, okay. With no lady friends to walk with, she couldn't motivate herself to go alone. And I think it's pretty commonly known that French food is buttery and delicious.
There you
so
go.
I can understand. I had the same thought. So yeah, maybe if she'd had a dog to take her out walking,
and
it would have been better.
Occasionally.
Yeah, salad. Niçoise salad. I mean, they have good salads there too. All the food in France is good. At least in my experience, everything I ate in France was like, oh, so good.
I've always wanted to go, never been.
Well, okay, so this total aside, I was in France and I was by myself a couple days actually, and I went to a restaurant. My dad had been to France in the last few years. And I was looking because I always do like duck, and I saw duck confit. And I was like texting my dad. I was like, "What's duck confit?" He goes, "A yummy duck treat."
Yes.
And I go, "But not for the duck." Poor duck.
If you're looking for good duck confit, there's a taqueria in Denver called Uno Mas, and they do a duck confit taco, and it is so good.
I typically, if I see duck on a menu, that and schnitzel, if I see either on a menu, I get it, because usually people don't put it on the menu unless they know how to do it. It's
true.
Because it is a pretty complex.
Slow poached in some kind of a fat.
Oh, yeah. And then they grill it and it's got a little crispy. Anyway, okay. Okay. So Abigail had read many plays, but she had never seen one in person. If you think about it, she was kind of like out in the country.
Yeah, but in Boston, you'd think.
I don't know how much. It was like the middle of the Revolutionary War. Like how many plays were being put on?
Pre-revolution. Okay, either way, go on.
Yeah, she was younger pre-revolution too. It kind of all happened like as she was like 20s, 30s. Like it.
I just find it surprising that in her whole life she had never been to a play when she grew up right around Boston.
I don't know.
It's amazing.
Her dad was a a parson, so maybe that was like, oh, don't go see that frivolity or so. I don't know. She'd never seen one in person.
There you go.
She was initially embarrassed to attend plays, but she eventually loved going to the theater. The intensity of the performances sometimes led her to believe the characters were real, causing physical reactions and headaches. She blushed at the sensuality, feeling uncomfortable with the lack of modesty, saying, quote, "The first dance which I saw upon the stage shook me. I felt my delicacy wounded, and I was ashamed to be seen to look at them."
Oh, my.
She was referring to girls wearing thin, short dresses, showing their garters and their underwear, shocked that they did not wear petticoats. But over time, she said, repeatedly seeing these dances has worn off that disgust, which I first felt. In the end, she grew to love both plays and the opera.
Dude, it's like the first time you have a funky cheese. You're like, gooey, goo. And then after a couple times, you're like, oh, give me that funky cheese.
Oh, yeah. Well, as soon as she made a few friends and settled into France, John was instructed to head back to London as the first ambassador to the court of St. James.
Wow.
Despite her initial frustration with her servants, she kind of was like, oh, they're all like vain and they only do one thing instead of doing 5 things.
So
like
they're all French is what she said.
They're very French. She was sad to say goodbye to them in the end. She was unable to take her bird due to its reaction to being caged and put into the carriage. It was freaking out in there. So she left it with her chambermaid, Pauline. She shared her plight of having to leave her bird with a fellow passenger on the boat to England, and he empathized and gifted her 2 songbirds he just happened to have with him.
What?
So she was like, I just had to leave my bird. And he was like, oh, well, here's some birds.
Take mine.
Just running around. Everyone like just running around with birds back then or something.
I'm imagining this guy has like birds wrapped up in his coat in his pockets or something. He's like, here's 2 birds.
I'm like picturing when they go to Hogwarts in Harry Potter and they have like the cage for Hedwig like on top of their trunks and there's just like a bird in a cage that's like clunking along. He's like, oh, hold on. I've got these clunky caged birds here.
But really quick, and I'll probably cut this out, but I heard this comedian talk about this where he's like, let's think about Harry Potter for a second here, right? Every one of these guys has the ability to instantly disappear and reappear wherever they want to, whenever they want to, with very little exception. And the way they've decided their prime form of communication is literally the slowest bird ever.
That's pretty funny.
And I was like, oh man, you're totally right. That makes no sense.
Did not think of that one. That one makes me chuckle. Oh, man. Well, on May 28th, 1785, Abigail and John arrived back in London and checked into rooms at a hotel in Westminster. A week later, she went to Westminster Abbey for a charity performance of Handel's Messiah. Now, if anybody's ever heard Handel's Messiah, it's an amazing piece of music, and you've probably heard the Hallelujah chorus. I have it queued up, but I don't know if we're allowed to play it. But we could play a few seconds of it, and I don't know what the rules are.
We probably could, and I can probably add it.
You could just overlay it, but it's the
Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Okay.
It's like you would know it, but I will say, every time I've heard the Hallelujah chorus, like with the organ and like the choir, it is like pretty moving music. It's pretty impressive. Abigail agreed. She described the performance as sublime beyond description to her friend Thomas Jefferson.
Whoa.
The only thing that took away from the performance was some lady behind her who wouldn't stop yapping.
Heard that, Abigail. We all been there.
I mean, really, I would think that back then people would be a little more tactful, but I guess people are the people.
I was just about to say that. I was like, I'm not one of those people that just goes, people don't change. No. I believe people can change. But when I hear these stories, I go, people have always been people.
People have always been people.
No matter what. There was probably an amphitheater of cavemen back in 9000 where Zug Zug was up at the front going, and somebody was behind going, and somebody was like, dude, come on. I'm listening to Zug Zug here.
And then someone gets really fed up and just like clubs that guy on the head.
Oh no, simpler times.
if Abigail could only have clubbed that woman on the head. I know. Well, shortly after, she met King George III and Queen Charlotte. As a reminder from our series on Queen Victoria, King George III was Queen Victoria's grandfather. The king attempted some small talk with Abigail, merely asking if she'd been on a walk that day. Inwardly, Abigail couldn't help but think, I spent the whole day getting ready to come meet you. Given her history of engaging in substantial conversations with the great minds and founding fathers, she was probably hoping for a more meaningful dialogue.
Well, this was King George III, so I don't know what point in time this would be, but this guy just came off of being insane, so...
Well, yeah, and I mean, surely he was just like, you have to just have something to say with everybody. I mean, he was meeting a line of people. It was like,
yeah,
you just have to make small talk. And so I think she was like, oh, this is an opportunity to show that I'm this smart woman. And then he was like, have you been on a walk today? And she's like, no, I was putting on my stupid petticoats to come see you.
Oh, man.
When she met Queen Charlotte a few hours later, she acknowledged that the queen and her daughters were pretty, but she found the rest of the ladies of the court to be, in general, very plain, ill-shaped, and ugly.
Probably all the inbreeding.
It kind of reminds me of like what Queen Victoria would have said too, like a little judgy.
Yeah.
Abigail's getting a little older. Abigail and Nabby opted for elegant yet plain dresses, defying the era's fashion for dresses adorned with flowers, gauze, gold, and silver. On another occasion, they were invited to the Queen's 42nd birthday celebration. Despite being born the same month as her husband, the Queen's celebration was held around her half-birthday to avoid interfering with the King's birthday celebration. At the party, Nabby apparently witnessed the Prince of Wales, who was Queen Victoria's uncle and later became King George IV, stumble and fall flat on his back. And if we remember him, he was the one that was addicted to alcohol, opium, and laudanum.
Oh, so he was maybe 3 sheets to the wind.
Yes, so she just kind of saw that a little bit, and she apparently thought it was interesting enough to put in a letter so that we know about it today. So I thought that was kind of funny. And like 6 degrees of 6 degrees of Queen Victoria.
It's also, it's a weird thought to think that these people are saying hello to the king and queen. And it was like, wasn't it like 3 or 4 years ago that you were all actively trying to kill us?
A little bit.
And shut us down? Like, I get it. Like, that's sort of what happens when revolutions happen. And then you get, independent, hopefully, when those revolutions happen. But I feel like it'd be an awkward first hello.
Yeah. Touche. But I guess, I don't know, if you do think about like the British, at least, it does seem like they're very like, okay, well, let's move on.
Yeah, I guess it's just one of those funny things where it's just like, I can imagine the king being like, oh, hello, my dear Abigail. So glad you didn't die during that last attack. Like, that's
I've actually got something coming up in a second that's a little along those veins. So along that vein, let me get there.
Okay.
But as far as social events in England, the rest were a little less thrilling because Abigail was expected to play cards with perfect strangers at most other parties. Gambling was unpleasant to Abigail. During one game, a woman she played with expected to beat her, but it turned out differently. Abigail reported, "It happened the other way. I won 4 games of her." So Abigail didn't enjoy gambling, but reluctantly admitted that she usually had been fortunate.
So she didn't like it, but she was good at it.
She played to win.
Right on.
John and Abigail's presence garnered attention in the newspapers with coverage ranging from positive to negative. And I think some of that is like, these revolutionaries are now here.
Sure.
They faced more negative remarks about John than they would have preferred. But one article criticized Abigail's carriage, deeming it only suitable for market trips and not for a delegate's wife.
Uh-huh.
They were like, her carriage.
How dare she ride in a subpar carriage?
Yes. So Abigail and John relocated from the hotel at Westminster to a house in Grosvenor Square, which Nabby dubbed the finest in this capital. Funny enough, it was across the street from Lord North, the former prime minister who had lost the American colonies. So kind of the same thing where you're like, oh, I'm glad you didn't die in that bombing. And now she's like, hi, old minister. I live across the street from you.
Have you ever seen The Madness of King George, the movie?
No, I need to.
You should, and I won't go into it a whole lot, but there's just this one point towards the end of it where he kind of comes out of, he was actually sick. He had a disease that they had to like help him with, basically. And at the end of it, he kind of comes to and he's clear-headed again. And he says to one of his advisors, and it's like I don't know exactly what the period of time was, but it was a long period of time. But he was really sick and really out of his mind. And he says to his advisor, he goes, the colonies. What happened with the colonies? And the guy goes, we lost the colonies.
Oh, gosh.
And King George has this really like sobering look on his face. And he just goes, all that untouched land. And I can only imagine, like, because at that point, they didn't even know how far back America went. And the United States as a country is something like 10 to 15 times the size of the UK. I want to say Colorado
I feel
alone.
like more than that, even.
Yeah, because I think Colorado is like, if you put Colorado on top of the UK, it almost takes up the entire thing. Like, that's how small the UK is. So to like have that in your brain of, oh my gosh, 50 times the size of my own country, most of which is by their definition, by European definition, untouched land. Obviously, we know better now. It was very much touched by a lot of people. But again, it was a very sobering thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. I saw something recently where maybe did we talk about this? A woman was just like, I don't need to go to Europe. I live in America. I can go to different states, and it's like 50 different countries.
It's true.
And like, obviously, I've loved every time I've gone to Europe and the food and the differences and just I enjoy it. But she's right. And like, we just took this road trip and we went through New Mexico, we went through Colorado to just the Four Corners, just touching there, Arizona, across over to San Diego, and then up through the Palm Desert, and then back through the Joshua Trees. And Utah, and it's like the Monuments Valley and all these things. And we didn't even see arches or like the petrified something in the painted desert. We didn't see any of this stuff that's also over there. And we were in the car for so long, and I just was looking out the window because it was so interesting. And it's just, this country is incredible geographically.
The more that I think about it, I don't think that there is a country that rivals the United States in terms of natural diversity.
Yeah.
I mean, we have everything from rainforests to literally some of the hottest, driest places in the world. And by the way, those two places are only separated by about 500 miles, which is an insane thought. Maybe 800, but I would argue that California is the best representation of that, because you go from San Diego up to Oregon, basically.
Yeah.
And that is just like, it takes you through everything. You go through the Mojave Desert, you go through the great, that gigantic, it used to be a lake, but it's basically just a gigantic plain in the middle of California. It's farmland now. We're like, anyways.
It's really cool. Anyway, travel the country. All right. So let's see. They moved into the house in Grosvenor Square across from their former prime minister. They moved in on July 2nd, which was 9 years to the day after the Continental Congress voted for independence. Abigail ensured she had her own special writing room, reminiscent of her Uncle Isaac's house and their residence in France. So when she was staying in Uncle Isaac's house for the inoculations, she had a special writing room, and then she had like 50 rooms in the France house. So she made sure she had her little writing room, and she wrote a lot, so that was important. Okay. Well, we mentioned at the beginning Nabby's engagement to Royal Tyler, kind of just it wasn't, they were still engaged, but they weren't like planning the wedding. It was kind of like in a standstill, sort of. A few months had passed since she arrived in Europe, and she'd not received any letters from Royal. And despite Nabby sending numerous letters to both him and her friends through him, which of course he failed to deliver, he was just like isolating her from her loved ones. He later claimed that those letters were lost at sea. Nabby suspected otherwise.
Yeah.
Abigail recognized a chance after seeing this behavior that maybe it was an opportunity to end the engagement and find Nabby a better match, which was a little bit risky at the time because breaking off an engagement was considered, and I'm quoting, an act of injustice.
Huh.
So you were engaged and then you break it off, you were doing, and I'll say some more about what people thought about this.
Okay.
So Nabby, not knowing what her mother was thinking, was fretting over Royal's lack of communication and this social dilemma, fearing that her parents would disapprove if she ended the engagement.
Sure.
And she'd initially pushed for it. She was like, oh gosh, I pushed for this engagement. Now my parents are going to be so mad at me. Abigail reassured her, though. She emphasized the need for tact. She said, if Nabby was conscious of any want of honor on the part of the gentleman, I and every friend she had in the world would rejoice if she could liberate herself. And so she had a big talk with Nabby, just being like, listen, this has gone south and we support you. So that really helped Nabby because she was like, oh no, oh no, oh no. I was like, I'm so in love with him, and I was kind of defying everybody, and now I don't want it anymore. What do I do?
It's cool that they supported her.
Well, it's kind of a tale as old as time. I mean, we think about how when we're young and we're so in love and like everyone's like, it's not right. And then they're like, no, but it's right. And now she's like, show you. No, it's not right.
She basically had to do you guys were right about this one.
Parents, you were right. Well, luckily, around this time, a new suitor emerged.
Ooh.
William Stevens Smith, who was serving as John's secretary and had been a colonel in the Revolution. Abigail could tell that Smith was smitten with her daughter Nabby. Mm-hmm. Once, when Abigail and Nabby were in the carriage, the crappy old carriage.
The carriage they should not be riding it.
They encountered Smith, and he was with a friend. Abigail wanted to invite Smith along, but seeing his companion, she said, oh, we'll do it another time. Smith was so smitten, though, that he, quote, ordered the door opened and in jumped, telling his companion that he would find him later.
Hey, all right, okay. Bros before hoes, buddy, but I get it.
Well, Nabby said, perhaps you will say that the colonel sacrificed politeness to gallantry. But at the time, he was unaware of Nabby's engagement. He withdrew his interest in her officially upon learning of the engagement, and he actually traveled to Prussia for a few months. Abigail noted that he left because he found it necessary for his peace. That's what she was telling everybody.
Sure.
It was not true. William Smith left for a few months so that Nabby would have time to break it off with Royal Tyler in a letter, make sure that he got the message and said, I got the message, and have a few more months in between so that when Smith came back from Prussia, they could get engaged with like plausible deniability.
Oh, so it was a scheme.
It was a bit of a scheme.
Plot.
It was a plot.
If we're going to talk about an old series.
Yes. Otherwise, without this kind of gap in between engagements, she could end up with a reputation, and I'm quoting, for fickleness and perhaps infidelity.
Oh, my.
So if she was just like, Royal, we're done, I'm marrying this other guy, people would be like, oh, you've been with this other guy already. And so he had to like go off on a whole, walkabout before he could come back and be like, oh, you're single now? Oh, well, let's get married.
Oh, convenient.
Well, breaking off the engagement with Royal was the right move.
Okay.
He started getting weirder and weirder, and then things took a scandalous turn. When word got back to Abigail's sisters about the broken engagement, they were shocked, but relieved. Mary Cranch kept Abigail in the loop, sharing some of the bizarre stuff that Tyler was up to. He was showing Nabby's letters to other people, which was just out of line. And we've talked about, like, Mercy Otis Warren writes a letter to Abigail and she shares it with John. Mm-hmm. But he's, like, getting a letter and, like, going into town and sharing Nabby's letter with, like, people at the pub or a party.
Let me
or
read this for you. How great is this? Well, this girl's it's so into me, like that kind of thing, I'd bet.
Well, and then he went around claiming that Nabby was crazy about him, and he was just like a little like lukewarm on the whole thing. After Nabby ended it, she asked for her miniature portrait back. Remember, like Victoria had given miniatures to people. Instead of returning it quietly, Tyler made a big show of keeping it, even talking sweetly to it and kissing it, trying to save face. When he finally admitted that she dumped him because of his behavior, he blamed her decision on rumors spread by her family. He said he'd go to England soon to sort everything out. But this is like classic narcissistic behavior.
Yeah.
He was screwing up, and then nothing was his fault. And her Aunt Mary was just she was saying these things and getting it in her head, that Nabby's head, that I wasn't. And none of it is true. It's not my fault. Anyway, classic narcissist.
Yep.
Meanwhile, in England, Colonel Smith, he was back from Prussia, and he was determined to marry Nabby on June 11th, 1786. There was a little bit of a hiccup because they didn't want to have an Anglican church wedding because they were Puritans. Oh. John got permission from the Archbishop of Canterbury to hold the ceremony in Grosvenor Square outside of the house. Nabby wasn't quite 21, so John had to sign his consent to her marriage using a notary. because he was she wasn't of age yet. Now, in ceremonies in New England, all you had to do was stand up and say, I do, after the vows. Like they'd say like, do you blah, blah, blah. And you just say, I do. But in England, you were supposed to repeat everything. And so that was like a little tedious. She was like having to repeat after me sort of I do's. But also the Archbishop of Canterbury modified the Anglican ceremony a little bit more to be a little more Puritan friendly. There was some stuff that was like difference between Anglicans and Puritans. And he kind of toned it down for the Puritans. So that was really nice.
It also sounds like our modern ceremonies are like an amalgamation of both of those.
Yeah, I think that's true, because I think we do all of it.
We do the repeat after me's and the
yeah.
I do's, you know,
Yeah.
so it's interesting.
Yeah, so I think we just took all the stuff and put it together and laughed.
Yeah, eventually.
Yeah.
Just kind of became one thing.
Well, Abigail, unable to sleep from the excitement, was up until at least 4 a.m. after the wedding. She wrote a letter to Mary summing up the day. Such was my situation last night when I gave my only daughter and your niece to the man of her choice.
Oh.
So she was very happy that this had worked out this way. Up next was finding Nabby and William a place to live. They stayed with John and Abigail for a few weeks until they found their own house nearby and moved in on July 1st. So it was like early June, and then moved in a couple weeks later. Quite adorably, John feared he might lose his strong relationship with his daughter because she was married and moving out. Yeah. It turns out his worries were unfounded. Nabby and Colonel Smith would join Abigail and John for lunch almost every single day.
Oh my gosh, wow.
They were really close. They just come over and have lunch.
It's cool.
Back home, Phoebe, the emancipated slave who'd been taking care of John and Abigail's home in Braintree, received praise from Uncle Cotton Tufts. He reported, Phoebe has been exceedingly attentive to the preservation and cleanliness of your house and household stuff. Abigail's extensive charity work, remember before she left, she was taking care of a lot of people. It meant that she had many patrons whom she'd fed, clothed, and aided in various ways. And this was like her mother had done this too. Like her mother was the wife of a parson and would constantly go to people's houses and give them what they needed. Oh. Abigail had been like, oh, you need firewood. Oh, you need clothes. Let me see if I can help you, because she was she was a wealthier woman in the area, and she was very good at giving charity. But unfortunately for Phoebe, these people turned to Phoebe and her husband William in Abigail's absence.
Okay.
So these are recently emancipated slaves living in Abigail and John's house, and these people are coming and being like, please, sir, I want some more. Not exactly, but they're like, hi, help us, because the people who live here help us, so you need to help us. Despite their past, they were still managing really well. They were helping these other people, and they also supported themselves by selling vegetables from their garden. So they were doing okay. Okay. And here and there, like, Cotton Tufts made sure that they were getting some things to help the people that were in need. But interesting that Phoebe had become this almost like benefactor in the community. Back home, Royal Tyler was spiraling. He'd spent a lot of time with his Boston landlords, Joseph and Elizabeth Palmer. Joseph Palmer was Richard Cranch's nephew. So Abigail's sister Mary married Cranch. This is Cranch's nephew.
Okay.
And he and his wife were landlords. So Royal had a mansion in Braintree, but also a place he stayed in Boston when he was in Boston. And his Boston landlords are these people. And I had to like reread that. That's why I explained it more. So Elizabeth Palmer, the Boston landlord's wife, started to defend Royal's breakup from Nabby to marry Cranch. She was like, oh, well, it wasn't his fault. She was kind of on his side. This was a little bit odd, but not that huge of a deal, until a few months later, when Elizabeth gave birth to a large, strong child on September 7th. But here's where it gets juicier.
Uh-oh.
Her husband had only been back in town for about 5 months
Uh-oh.
after a 7-month business trip. It was painfully obvious that this huge, healthy baby was not Joseph Palmer's, her husband. Mary Cranch visited the Palmers after the birth and saw an interesting sight. I'm going to quote her. Elizabeth sitting by the bed suckling her infant. Nearby, with one slipper off and one foot just stepped into the other, was Royal Tyler. there appeared to be the most perfect harmony between all three. So, like, his landlord has a baby and he's just like sitting back there like with his little slippers kind of off. I imagine him like in an armchair but like with a leg like draped over one arm. Years later, baby Sophie would go to live with her big sister Mary Palmer. So it was Elizabeth Palmer was the woman that had the baby. Mary Palmer was a daughter.
Okay.
And baby Sophie went to live with Mary Palmer and her husband, Royal Tyler. So you got that right. Royal Tyler got his landlady, Elizabeth Palmer, pregnant. And then he married Elizabeth Palmer's daughter,
oh my gosh,
Mary, and raised his wife's sibling / his bastard child with her.
That is a complicated, that is a Game of Thronesian situation
little
right
bit.
there. That is...
I mean, I wonder if they kind of kept it on the DL and acted like it was Mary Palmer's baby all along or something.
I would only imagine, because in just that age of propriety, you probably want to maintain status quo above all else. Oh boy. And really quickly, by the way, as you were talking, I had to look it up because there's something that has been tickling the back of my brain, and I was right. Heinz has definitely already made Cranch. Oh yeah. Let me show you.
Wait, what?
It is ketchup ranch combo.
Ketchup ranch combo.
It is squeezable ketchup ranch.
But with a K, not a C.
With a K. K-R-A-N-C-H.
Cranch.
Cranch. I was like, oh my gosh. Anyway.
Oh, hey, we're having french fries. Can you get the cranch?
Where's the cranch? That is honestly, every time you say it, you're like, with cranch, I'm like, where's the ketchup ranch?
I also picture like kind of a lanky guy. Like he's kind of lanky and tall and cranch. I don't know. There's something about the way I visualize cranch. Anyway,
I can see that.
In another surprising twist, shortly after this, Mary Cranch, Abigail's sister, checked in on Phoebe. There were reports that Phoebe and her husband were housing, quote, straggling Negroes who'd been lodging and staying in the house sometimes for 3 or 4 days together. So Abigail and John's house had kind of become this little, I don't know, small, not hotel, but like, you know, a boarding
house
place
kind of thing. Yep.
For some of these maybe emancipated or runaway slaves, possibly.
Sure.
Cotton Tufts forbade Phoebe from doing this, but her compassion led her to continue helping these people. Among them was a pregnant black woman who was the servant of Royal Tyler, likely pregnant with his child.
Oh my gosh. Royal
promised to provide food and firewood to Phoebe if she and her husband continued to care for the woman. Despite objections from Cotton Tufts and now Mary Cranch, like they were kind of like watching over things for Abigail and John. They're like, don't do this. Phoebe let the woman stay in the house. Royal Tyler instructed, just keep her concealed. Just don't let anybody know she's there.
Hide her.
But loyal Phoebe informed Mary. She's like, he told me to do this. Like, I know this isn't actually my house. In the end, the woman just left. And Royal never delivered on his promise of food or firewood.
Shocking.
He
seems like the guy that would do that.
Well, in Braintree, everybody missed Abigail, Nabby, and John. Even Susanna Hall, who was John's mother and Abigail's mother-in-law. But Susanna Hall couldn't resist adding a little hint of guilt with her "I miss you." You know, she was a mother-in-law.
I was going to say, I think pretty much every mother indiscriminately has an ability to give a guilt trip in a really unique, specific kind of way.
Yes. Well, she seems a little kind of funny. I'll read a quote in a second. Abigail continued to support Phoebe, but Susanna also felt that she should receive a little charity, claiming she was sure she was, quote, nobody was poorer than she was. Like, nobody's poorer than I am. I'm
the poorest of the poor.
I'm your mother-in-law. This was due to her deceased first husband and then elderly second husband. Eventually, Abigail instructed Cotton Tufts to provide her mother-in-law with a quarterly cash allowance. And I think it came out of proceeds from Abigail's bonds.
Wow.
So she kind of made it better. But like they had gotten along for years, and then she's overseas for a few years, and Susanna's like, but what about me? And I think I said it when they left for Europe, she was like, well, this is the last you'll see of me.
That's
I'm
right.
so
You
old.
did say that.
So she was a
You'll
little
probably never see me again.
never see me
But
again.
whatever.
Enjoy your jaunt across the pond. Anyway, meanwhile, John Quincy was over at Harvard. Charles, he was about to join John Quincy at Harvard, and young Tommy was being prepared for Harvard. So Abigail sent some science books that she had acquired so that the boys could study in preparation and, study the science and stuff. But she also suggested that her nieces read them too. So like Mary's daughters.
Cool.
Remarking that, quote, science can only be learned in the laboratory, but from these our sex are almost wholly excluded. So she was like, I wish my nieces could go into the lab and learn some science, but they're not allowed in there. So here's some books.
This also does seem to follow pretty closely along with what we've sort of found families do in the past, like with Ian Fleming's family. Everybody go check out the series on Ian Fleming. Same thing. Every one of them had to go to Eton College, period, no ifs, ands, or buts. And then it was like, from there, you're probably going to go to Oxford or Cambridge, but if you're not going to go there, then you're going to go to the Royal Military Academy. And it was like, it was pretty
There was a path.
structured path idea of what this family wanted. So I kind of weirdly understand it from that age. Anyway.
Harvard.
I'm a Harvard man.
In response to the books being sent and Mary's daughters being told to go ahead and read them, Mary said, noting her husband had a role as a senator in Massachusetts, she said that it was important for the wives of public officials to educate themselves about public affairs. So she kind of was like, oh, science and also public affairs. Like, I'm the wife of a government man. I need to know what's going on, and it's my responsibility. Despite her daughter Lucy, at the time she was learning the harpsichord, which was a traditional female pastime, Mary believed that Lucy's soul was more attuned to science than harmony. And she said, had she been a boy, she would have been a mathematician.
Wow.
And it's just interesting. I wonder what Abigail Adams and Mary Cranch think about today. Just all the things that they could not do, and they just kind of almost joked about it because what were they going to do? And now we're like, we can do it.
It reminds me of this quote. I can't remember who said it, but it was somebody, sort of a modern scientist or thinker, and basically said, Einstein is interesting, but the thing that occupies my mind most now is thinking of all the Einsteins that have died over the years in the bottoms of mines and through slave labor and through poverty, and they never got the chance to become an Einstein.
Yeah.
It's like pretty deep.
Right, because they just literally weren't in the position to even pursue those things.
Right. And it reminds me of the same thing of her basically saying if she was born a man, she wouldn't be sitting playing the harpsichord. She'd be doing...
Maybe she would have discovered some sort of Pythagorean theorem or something.
It could have been 100 years before the Curie family did anything or something. We just don't know. It's sad.
We don't. Well, around this time, John realized that the British just really weren't interested in negotiating treaties with the United States, kind of like what you were saying. So he tendered his resignation to the U.S. government and gave them a year to find a replacement before he could head home to Braintree. Abigail was thrilled to be coming home, but they had a year, so they spent that time enjoying, everything they could. Abigail attended a series of science lectures. Nabby actually had her first baby, and Abigail joyfully wrote to her niece Lucy, "I'm a grandmama," which is funny. I had to say that because my mom, we say grandmama to the dogs when we talk about my mom. Grandmama. The baby was named William Steuben Smith after his father, William Stephen Smith, and Baron Frederick von Steuben of the Continental Army, who'd been a drill master from Prussia.
Steuben's a good name.
Steuben. Abigail expressed, "I already felt as fond of him as if he was my own son. Nay, I can hardly persuade myself that he is not. He's just my little baby."
I feel like that's all grandparents.
It's all grandparents. She noted that Nabby was a really good nurse, and surprisingly, by the age of 3 months, the baby was already eating solid food and nursing only twice a day.
Oh my gosh, I don't know much about babies, but that seems fast.
I mean, but by solid food, I think they mean mushed up solid food, but still, it does seem fast.
I thought it was 8 months of milk, and that was,
also,
I have no idea.
Might she have been a little bit exaggerating? I don't know. Who knows?
I don't know.
My grandchild is so advanced.
Growing so fast that in 3 months.
In the year between John's resignation and their return to the United States, John Quincy graduated from Harvard. He was asked to give a speech on the importance and necessity of public faith to the well-being of a community, partially because his father was John Adams. And he was struck with anticipatory stage fright.
I bet.
This is a guy who goes on to become president, by the way.
Yeah.
Mary wrote to Abigail saying, "My nephew walks about with his hands hung down, crying, 'Oh Lord, I hope it will rain so hard that all their white wigs may be wet. Who would not let us have a private commencement?'" So apparently there was a recession, and basically after the war, it was like this kind of extremely volatile market and recession at the time.
Can imagine.
Causing high taxes from post-revolution debts, and basically because of all this, the class had requested a private commencement and avoiding the big hullabaloo of the event of the season.
Sure.
But the powers that be at Harvard said, no, we're going to have the big commencement. So he was like, I didn't even want to do this.
It's probably because they were like, we can make more money this way.
Probably. Well, also just the pomp and circumstance. Like Harvard wouldn't do
true.
that because of Harvard is Harvard.
True.
Well, Mary's son also graduated from Harvard, and they had an Adams Cranch graduation party combined. Phoebe, who helped with the preparations, proved exceedingly useful, according to Mary. She reported back to Abigail. Phoebe was just doing so well.
Wow.
The party included a full dinner for 100 people, and then wine and cake for another 300 people. So big party.
Yeah.
Mary's cake contained 28 pounds of flour.
Whoa.
And she gave a rare toot of her own horn and said, "And a fine plum cake it was."
No, dude, I cannot even
28 pounds of flour.
imagine.
I mean, that would almost fill this.
I'm trying to think of. I mean, it's hard enough to bake a cake right now with ovens where you can say, "I want you to be at 350 degrees." So for her to do that, and then also in like a tin that was big enough to hold it.
What kind of bowl did they have to mix this cake?
That's unbelievable. I mean, I'm just thinking about the cake pan that it would have to get baked in. How long would that bake be? That would be like a 4-hour bake.
I wonder though, and maybe someone who knows about like 200 years ago, 300 years ago cooking. I've been to in New Bern, North Carolina. It was like the governor's mansion at the time, and they have like the authentic original kitchen. And it did have like this really big, like walk up to it hearth thing. So it could be that maybe the cake wasn't so much liquid in a pan as it was on a big plank or something. And it was more of a dough on top. I don't know. I could see that, but also, I don't know. It was probably a big pan.
I'm amazed.
Yeah. Or very dense.
That's actually probably pretty accurate. It was probably pretty dense.
But now I kind of want to have a plum cake, Mary Cranch style.
So I'm also, though, thinking about, and we'll move on quickly, the 28 pounds of flour, but you also have to have the sugar, and you have to have some milk in there, and some eggs, and I'm like, dude.
I wonder maybe how sweet was stuff back then.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sounds like I'd still want to try it.
I would have a bite.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so Mary also reported back to Abigail about Charles's behavior at the party, the second son. Charles had been developing into somewhat of a ladies' man. Mary commented on the variety of shades and colors of hair locks he wore in his rings. I'll get to this in a second. She said, "I fancy you are a general admirer of the sex." So these were rings that were fashion at the time, and if we've heard Victoria and other things, sometimes you'd have a lock of hair of like maybe a deceased family member, but apparently also you'd take a lock of hair of like someone you were smitten with, and then they'd put it in jewelry so you could wear it around. And so I was Googling and trying to find like hair lock jewelry, and I found some. I found like one ring, and it was on a thing about mourning, but I think it's the same concept. You have a ring and then you put a little hair in it, and then it's like, this is my sweetheart's, but he had more than one.
Okay.
So
jeez.
He was kind of a ladies' man.
And it sounds like an equal opportunity employer as well, if you know what I mean.
Yes. Well, a few months later, Royal Tyler just walked out of his mansion in Braintree and moved to New York. He was done with all of it.
He left his family?
Well, he didn't. I think that the Mary and the child thing actually happened later.
Okay.
He bailed to New York, and I think maybe that marriage came later, or maybe he took them. It didn't say. Maybe he took his bastard daughter slash baby mama's daughter, wife. Maybe he took him with him. But the point is, he bailed from Braintree and he left his mansion behind. Now, he'd bought it on credit, though. So he didn't even try to sell it. He just said, forget it.
Wow.
Like, I don't care. And his creditors were highly motivated to recoup their losses because of this, which was an opportunity for the Adams family to buy a mansion in Braintree for them to live in on their return to Massachusetts. Remember, they'd been living in bigger houses, so they needed a mansion.
Da-da-da-dun.
I didn't snap loud in here, but there was a snap. But yes, the Adams family mansion. I think it was a little less, I don't know, gruesome.
Creepy?
Yeah. At the same time this was happening, John had his heart set on buying a farm owned by their neighbors, the Veseys. Abigail was not in agreement on this, and she told Cotton Tufts to just ignore John's request to buy this farm. The farm was listed for £300, and Abigail calculated that even if they paid only £250, they'd only get about a 4% return on their investment, like from the stuff that the farm could yield. John was always in favor of land as an investment because it was less risky than government bonds. Abigail was a high-risk, high-reward kind of gal. We know that most of her risks paid off for the family. And actually, there was a note in this book that the primary source, the author said that many people, if there was more financial records left behind, people suspect that the Adamses died wealthy, whereas a lot of other founding fathers died with nothing at all.
Oh, okay.
And they think that it was Abigail's decisions that gave them all this wealth. It was not so much John at all.
I'm not surprised by that in the slightest.
Yeah. Well, Cotton Tufts did do what John asked, and he bought the VC's farm, but he negotiated the price down to only £200. So he got it for 30% off, so not bad. Right after that, he also purchased Royal Tyler's abandoned mansion for £600, which was said to be one of the finest houses in Braintree.
And then they still also have like half of Vermont or whatever, right?
Yeah,
With
they
their
have the Vermont
400
stuff.
acres or
They
something.
have the land that came from her mother.
Wow.
And then like Susanna's living on land that
It's
came
like
from
a little Adams real estate empire here. It's sweet.
They've got a lot going on. Well, the mansion came with a dairy, and Abigail proposed that Phoebe run it. She said, "I think it may be with safety to be trusted to Phoebe, provided she will undertake it. Like, I'll let Phoebe run it if she wants to." She also sent Phoebe a pamphlet on running a dairy, which gives us the assumption that Phoebe was able to read, which as a slave she might not have been able to.
Sure.
So that was interesting. She also asked for the dimensions of the rooms in the mansion, though, so she could plan the layouts.
Wow, okay, cool.
So she's getting ready to come home, and she's like, I'm moving into my mansion in Braintree. Well, we're going to change the subject a little bit because we haven't talked about Abigail's misfit brother, Black Sheep, William, for a while.
That's right.
There's a quick anecdote about William. I didn't tell this in order because I wanted to just kind of loop it now. A few years before, when Colonel William Smith came onto the scene and was courting Nabby in 1785, Nabby's now husband, he had to clear up a case of like mistaken identity. His name was also William Smith, right?
Okay.
So a man named George Irving had a debt with William Smith. And he pursued that debt when he caught wind that William Smith was in London and was marrying the Adams daughter. And he actually had a debt with Abigail's brother, William Smith. But William Smith, her son-in-law, was like, I don't know what this is about. I've never heard of George Irving. And so he read the letter to Abigail, and Abigail was like, a few sentences in, she's like, I just smacked my forehead.
I heard it on the microphone.
This is my brother, William Smith. And so she had to explain to her son-in-law, William Smith, this is what's happened. This is the kind of guy he is. And then she had to like write a letter to George Irving to be like, you've got the wrong William Smith. It's this William Smith. And like, kind of like, they didn't really talk about him. And so she had to kind of like, oh yeah, let me tell you about this brother of mine. And so it was a little bit odd. Also, I was looking back because I was trying to confirm a date. And I was looking in the index of my book, and there are 5 William Smiths in the index of my main book. 5 different
That's
ones.
not even at all surprising.
Abigail also, names-wise, was born Abigail Smith. She married John Adams. She became Abigail Smith Adams. Her daughter Nabby was named Abigail Adams. She married a Smith. She became Abigail Adams Smith. So they switched names.
That is really, really funny.
It's super funny. Well, unfortunately for Abigail's brother, William Smith, the one in debt to George Irving, well, he died. In October of 1787 at the age of 40 from cirrhosis of the liver. At this time, it was called Black Jaundice. I just thought that was like a cooler, scary name for what it is. So William's wife didn't find out that he was dead for a month because he was so estranged from her.
Oh my gosh.
Sadly, Mary's letter telling Abigail the news of her brother's passing also shared word that Uncle Isaac had passed away.
Oh.
Surprisingly, he had died with somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 pounds of debt.
Ooh.
It was to a British mercantile firm. Cotton Tufts, managing the estates, because he was just the guy. He did what he could to make sure the debt was settled, and Uncle Isaac's heirs still received a little something and were able to remain on their estate. Cotton Tufts blamed Uncle Isaac's debt on state and federal officials, allowing market prices of government securities to fall so far below their face value. Ironically, Abigail had bought many of these securities at those low values, and ultimately they turned out to be profitable. But the timing just wasn't on Uncle Isaac's side.
Yeah.
Got to time that market. Anyway,
I can also only imagine. I mean, it's a weird thing to think about. A brand new country, and then saying, "Cool, this country has to figure out all of the boring stuff, all of the tax codes, all of the how is this going to work? How is our Federal Reserve going to work? All these different things, which I know Alexander Hamilton was a huge part of.
We're gonna get into a little bit of that here too, but I only touch a little bit on it. But you're right. This is a new country.
And a very uncertain time financially, I can imagine, for all these people.
And the concept of a bond is okay, you buy so we can have money to fund the government. We'll pay you back,
right?
And that's good, except that when they can't pay it back, it gets bad. But then anyway, and then there's all this speculation. But anyway, we'll get a little more into that a little later. So that letter carried the news of the loss of her brother and her uncle, which was sad. Soon after, there was another letter with some unsettling news. Her sons, Charles and Thomas, had been involved in a riot, is what they called it, at Thanksgiving dinner at Harvard Hall. So they were dining for Thanksgiving dinner, and there was maybe a food fight. I don't know. Apparently Charles was probably one of the ringleaders too. It wasn't just they were there.
I'm really curious what the context of this was. Because if it was a true to form food fight, fun. If it's no, people got hurt, maybe not as fun.
I think it was probably a food fight that got out of hand. I don't know. But both boys were fined 10 shillings. They had a fine. Now, in the summer of 1787, 55 of the most prominent men in the country gathered in Philadelphia proposing a restructuring of the American government. At the time, each state was sovereign. For example, Massachusetts was as separate from Pennsylvania and New York as the U.S. is from Canada today.
Wow.
The Constitution was signed in Philadelphia, turning the 13 autonomous states into a single nation. This led to a bit of a schism in the government, resulting in the Federalists, those in favor of a strong central government and in support of the ratification of the Constitution, which resolved some of the issues that were part of the Articles of Confederation, which was the first Constitution, basically. Right. So it resulted in a schism that had Federalists, those guys, and Anti-Federalists, who were eventually called Republicans, who feared that such a centralized authority governmental authority. They advocated for stronger protections for states' rights and individual liberties. Eventually, when the Constitution was ratified, it was only because of the addition of the Bill of Rights, which further protected individual liberties. So they were we really got to come together because having all these 13 colonies doing everything, it's not going to work. But then some people were wait a second, this is just going to turn into another England. Right. They were hold up. So and then I think we see that today, the Republican Party is the less government party,
Versus
state
right.
rights, and so it that is precipitates to today.
Interesting.
Well, John and Abigail's friends, Mercy and James Warren, were anti-federalists.
Uh-oh.
Mercy published a series of anonymous essays warning that the formation of this new government would turn the American Republicans into a tyrannical dictatorship. I hadn't mentioned it yet, but John and Abigail actually were in the process of having like a slow falling out with the Warrens altogether. Mercy's sons in particular were like degenerates.
Okay.
And John and Abigail wanted to keep their sons away from those sons just because they were bad influence. So they kind of been having a falling out. There's a little more that'll come later that I'll talk about. Now, when the Constitution was ratified, it was by a narrow margin of only 34 to 32.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. The next step was to elect a president and a vice president. Rumor had it that John would be the vice president. Back then, whoever came in second in the election was the vice president. And John and Abigail needed to get home in case this happened.
Yep.
On the mounting list of difficult things to deal with in their final year in Europe was Abigail's servant. This is just kind of an interesting aside. Esther Field's health. Esther Field had been on the boat across with her and
Okay.
Nabby, and she was there. And
Have we heard about Esther Field
well,
yet?
I think we talked about Esther's brother Job. So it was anyway. Esther Field is just a servant that was there, and she stayed the whole time. She was the last one to get over her seasickness on the passage across. Actually, she was kind of weak.
She was one of them that got super seasick. Okay.
Yes. Now, in late 1787, right before their voyage home, Esther had come down with a mysterious illness. On New Year's Day of 1788, Abigail wrote to her sister that she believed Esther's time would come soon.
Oh my gosh.
Doctors could not figure out what was wrong with her. In February, Esther came to Abigail, a bit embarrassed and surprised. She wasn't sick. She was pregnant.
I knew it.
The father was another servant, John Briesler, and Abigail had been aware that they were romantically interested in each other and they planned to marry once they returned to America, but I guess this surprise was a surprise to everybody. They had a little shotgun wedding just in case the baby was like born on board of the boat, so it wasn't illegitimate. Abigail said to Mary in a letter, "So totally blindsided was I, and my physician too, that we never once suspected her any more than she did herself."
Oh my gosh.
And it made me think of Lady Flora Hastings.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, "You are pregnant," and she had like a tumor. And then like this one is like, "She must have a tumor," and she was just pregnant.
Which anybody, if you're curious, go check out the Queen Victoria series if you want to learn more about Lady Flora Hastings.
Yeah, Lady Flora Hastings didn't end so. It was more tragic than this.
Yeah, slightly sadder end.
Yeah. But anyway, yay, a baby in a marriage. Hooray.
Hooray.
Well, Abigail was happy to be headed home, but she was sad because she'd have to part with Nabby.
Oh.
They'd never been apart.
Wow.
Abigail and Nabby had always been together. Nabby and her husband would return to America, but they would be going to Jamaica, Long Island instead of to Braintree, because that's where William Smith was from. He was from Long Island.
Oh, there's a town called Jamaica?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Didn't know that.
This was to be near his family. Abigail wrote to her in-laws saying to be kind to Nabby and warning them of her very silent character. She was like, "My daughter's a little weird. Please be nice."
So if she's quiet, don't take it personally, basically.
Because remember, Abigail was like, "Oh, Nabby wants to come and be your servant house person. And she's so quiet, though. You'll like her." And this was before and then they like built a relationship. Anyway, it's kind of funny. Abigail and John set sail on April 20th on a ship named the Lucretia. The crossing took 2 months. When they arrived, they were met with a hero's welcome, led by Governor John Hancock of Massachusetts.
Oh, Johnny boy and his big signature.
A man whom they both thought was a buffoon.
So, in the show QI, it's a British show. I don't know if you've ever seen it before. It's like a kind of a halfway quiz show. It's really great. But they don't know in the UK generally. If you say, "Can I get your John Hancock?" They don't know what that means.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they had to explain it on the show. They were like, the way that they explained it, they were like, "So for anybody who's not American, if you look at the American Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and it's got all these different people that have signed it or whatever, and you can see what happened. There was this line of people that were all supposed to sign. It was like first person like, "I'm going to sign my name right here," and then person, "I'm going to sign my name right here," and then John Hancock steps up and is just like, "John Hancock." All over the Declaration of Independence.
a bit buffoonishy,
which
is what they thought he was. Luckily for John Adams, he was able to duck out of Boston the next day, but Abigail was forced to stay at their house for a few days. But then she got to head to Braintree and move into her new mansion. It was called the Borland, but John called it Stonyfield. I don't know. It was the mansion that
Wonder why it was called Stonyfield.
Probably some stones. Abigail was sad to see that her house had a number of partially finished renovations, and she had to hire, quote, a swarm of carpenters, masons, and farmers to finish them quickly. Compared to the Paris house, the house was tiny. Abigail immediately began planning on additions. Also, to her dismay, much of her furniture, china, and other items had not fared so well in the stormy crossing across the Atlantic. So a lot of stuff was broken. I think she had to repair some things. She probably had to get rid of some things. So that was a bummer. She then headed to Long Island because Nabby was pregnant again with her second child. Nabby hadn't really wanted to fuss. And her son, John Adam Smith, was actually born before Abigail arrived to help out. Abigail noted that the baby was delivered by a Negro woman who had on some former occasions assisted with some of her own color. Nabby was instructed to lie in for up to a month after the delivery, which was common. If you were middle to upper class, you were supposed to just lay around in your bed and do nothing. But with her mother's arrival, she was up and about a little sooner than that.
That's cool.
While in New York, Abigail was near what John referred to as the best sources of political scuttlebutt.
Oh, okay.
I love scuttlebutt. That's a fun word.
Hey, what's the scuttlebutt?
Scuttlebutt. And he wanted Abigail to share what gossip she heard about his potential to become vice president in the election. He also wanted her to be sure, though, to not say the wrong thing while trying to get the information.
Be tactful.
To this, she said, I designed to be vastly prudent. I assure you. I got this, John.
Pretty much, right?
Don't worry.
Or if it was in today's terms, it would be, yeah, I know.
I know.
And that's it.
Do you think I'm a dinghy? Like dingus? Anyway, so Abigail got a bit of hot goss from New York congressman who was named John Jay. And I'd heard of John Jay.
I was going to say, it sounds
familiar.
familiar.
Yeah, he was another one of the guys that was around back then.
There's
a lot of them.
There's a lot of them.
We learned about them all back in high school. Anyway, when John Jay came to talk with Abigail, he was pretty sure John would be elected as vice president. He told Abigail to relay to John, you have received your portion of the bitter things in politics. It is time you should have some sweets. The day that she wrote this in a letter and sent it to John, the presidential electors actually cast their ballots. So he didn't even get that message before the ballots were cast. George Washington won the presidency. I'm sorry, spoiler alert. And coming in second was John Adams, the vice president. Back then, presidents and vice presidents didn't run together on a single ticket. This was adopted by the 12th Amendment in 1804. Soon afterward, Abigail returned to Braintree, and John headed off to New York to start his new job.
Also, if I'm not mistaken, it was Thomas Jefferson who made that change.
I did not know that.
I'm pretty sure I know that from the musical Hamilton. Anyway.
All right, so Abigail goes back to Braintree because she had to pack up all of her furniture that she had only just unpacked to take it over to New York. So they basically get to Braintree, she unpacks, sets up her house, and then immediately she has to move to New York.
That's funny.
So she's sad about that. But, this is what happens when your husband becomes the vice president. Anyway, let's address Charles, young Charles. Despite his infamous Thanksgiving Day riot incident the year prior, reports from his cousin, Billy Cranch, suggested that Charles was causing a little more trouble again at Harvard. With graduation approaching, John and Abigail decided it was best for Charles to relocate to New York and live with them.
Okay.
There, he would study law under Alexander Hamilton. Charles even agreed to skip commencement and head straight to New York for after his final class.
Wow.
So he was like, sure, parents, I'll come live with you. John's salary for vice president was $5,000, only a fifth of what the president made. He called the position of vice president, quote, the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived.
That's really funny.
Which is kind of like the whole premise of the show Veep.
which I still haven't seen.
Oh, see, there's one that you should
and
see.
I love Julia Louis-Dreyfus, so
It is really funny. But yeah, she's basically like, I'm the vice president, but it means nothing. It's like terribly nothing. She's like never in meetings with the president. She doesn't get to do anything. It's like, I don't know. It's pretty funny. But watch Veep. It'll make you chuckle.
I plan to, just haven't done it yet.
Okay. Abigail joined John at Richmond Hill in New York, which sat on top of a hill overlooking the Hudson River, a mile and a half north of New York City, where Greenwich Village is now. So meaning like the financial district of New York is kind of where, so it's up there. If you've ever been to New York, it's in Greenwich Village. Obviously, that house is not there anymore because real estate. I saw a picture of it in a book.
They were basically the original hipsters then.
Yeah, basically. Abigail quickly received an invitation to visit Martha Washington. Ooh. She'd met George before, but not Martha. She said of Martha, her hair is white, her teeth beautiful, her person rather short than other ways. She was beautiful, white hair, white teeth, and she was short.
And tiny.
Tiny. Abigail anticipated a shift in her role now that John was vice president. While she had engaged in correspondence with him and mingled with the founding fathers before, she hadn't been as central to the action as she would be now. Despite John's dismissive view of the position, Abigail feared its prestige might affect her. She urged her friends to monitor her behavior, stating that they should, quote, watch over my conduct, and if at any time they perceive any alteration in me with respect to them, arising as they may suppose from my situation in life, I beg they would, with the utmost freedom, acquaint me with it. She preemptively asked them to call her out if she changed.
Yeah, that's crazy cool.
I was like, that's super cool.
Staying humble.
Abigail found New York reminiscent of her Parisian experience. Not quite to her liking.
Oh, because she grew to like Paris to an extent,
but like
though.
she first got there and she didn't love it. And
Gotcha.
This is kind of how she felt. She lamented, "It is next to impossible here to get a servant from the highest to the lowest grade that does not drink, male or female." One of the footmen she approved of came from Boston, a fact that she continued to point out. She's like, the only servant I could find that's worth anything is from Boston.
Gosh.
Where I'm from.
Probably just meant that servant could hold his liquor better.
Maybe. Moreover, she struggled to find a suitable preacher, as all in New York were evangelical. Describing their services, she remarked, "The oratory of a clergyman here consists of foaming loud speaking, working themselves up in such an enthusiasm as to cry." She preferred a little more reserved demeanor.
She wasn't into the whole,
Hail!
Yeah, is it Pentecostals that are really loud about things? I can't remember.
Maybe. I mean, just evangelical. I just think of a televangelist. Like, that's what I'm seeing. And she's thinking he's like, the Lord rain down!
I'm thinking of the ones that can't just say Lord. They'll go, Lord.
Lord. I think it's more Southern, but generally this. Yes. I mean, So... And she was a little more Southern if she was in New York City. She'd moved sortless.
Now she's in the deep South. She's in New York.
Yes. Anyway, moving to New York did have its perks, including a spacious house where Nabby and her family could also reside.
Wow.
So they moved over from Jamaica, Long Island to live with mom and dad.
That's funny.
Abigail found joy in having Nabby and her grandchildren close by. Charles appeared to have turned over a new leaf under his parents' roof. However, Abigail couldn't help but notice Nabby's rapid succession of children, similar to her own experience. She'd hoped Nabby would consider slowing down. And actually, remember, Queen Victoria was worried about this for her oldest daughter, too. Mm-hmm. Like, you're having babies too fast.
Pussy, right?
Pussy. Pussy and Nabby.
Again, if you want to know more about Pussy, go check out our Queen Victoria series.
Meanwhile, Abigail's 39-year-old sister, Elizabeth Shaw, unexpectedly became pregnant, prompting Abigail to comment, "It is really a foolish business to begin, after so many years, a second crop." Abigail didn't hesitate to voice her opinions on others' pregnancies and their apparent lack of prevention measures. Despite the absence of modern birth control methods, scholars believe women of the time were aware of ways to avoid pregnancy, even if they weren't foolproof. I mean, I'm thinking of the rhythm method.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Basically, the rhythm method is like figuring out when the cycle is and generally noticing like,
gotcha.
Okay, we're not going to engage around this time of the month.
Gotcha.
So anyway,
I was thinking like, what preventative measures did they really have back in the day, but we don't have to get into that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know, but I'm guessing it was something like that.
Okay.
The biggest problem Abigail had to deal with, though, was the myriad of social engagements and how many people she was expected to call on now that she was the wife of the vice president and living in New York. Her house was too close to downtown New York to pretend to be out of town, because she did think of that. I'll just pretend to be out of town. She's too close. People knew.
They're like, dude, you're a mile away.
We can see you. She had so many visitors that it was exhausting. So she took a note from Martha Washington, who had a single day a week where she had an open house that everyone could come to. These were called levees. It was just on Tuesdays, we go to Martha's house. When she was at these parties at Martha's house, her place was directly to the right of Martha Washington.
Okay.
Now, sometimes ladies would come up and start to talk to her, and they would take Abigail's little spot. Maybe she was out and she needed to come back to stand next to Martha, and her spot was occupied by somebody. But George Washington would see this, and he would make sure to remove the lady from Abigail's post.
That's funny.
In the summer of 1790, Creek Indians from present-day Georgia and Alabama journeyed to New York to negotiate the Treaty of New York with the United States. This was ratified on August 7th, and there were fights and skirmishes. They were coming up with a treaty to we got to stop fighting.
Sure.
Abigail hosted one of the diplomats, Miko Mako, who she found strikingly handsome. She commented on how I think his physique was the perfect. She was like, this is what a guy should look like.
Sure. She's also probably looking at this guy being like, oh my gosh, he's tan.
Well, here we go. So he bestowed upon her a Creek name, Mamia, though its meaning remains unclear, and she didn't know what it meant. My research, I was just Googling and putting in words. It might have been the name of a fruit tree. I don't know. But if someone knows what Mamia, Mammea, meant in the Creek language, that was Abigail's name. Another delegate, Alexander McGillivray, of mixed Scottish, French, and Creek heritage, surprised Abigail with his American attire and fluent English, prompting her to remark, "He speaks English like a native, and I should never have suspected him to be of the nation, as he is not very dark." So she was noticing their differences in skin colors and everything, but this Alexander McGillivray was a mixed lineage, and he was one of the delegates that came up to negotiate.
More fair.
Yes. In the same month, August 1790, not 1970, 1790, legislation was adopted to fund the $54 million U.S. debt.
Okay.
In January of 1790, Alexander Hamilton had presented an extensive report on the enormous federal debt, which at the time was, again, $54 million in today's dollars. That is $1,821 million in some more decimals. The United States national debt today. So that was $1,800,000,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know.
Our national debt is $34 trillion. I reverse inflation calculated this, and $34 trillion today was just over $1 trillion in 1790. So they had a $54 million debt, and they were like, yikes! If they had the debt we have now in that year, it would have been $1 trillion instead of $54 million.
That is unbelievable.
And I wonder what the founding fathers would think about this, but it's interesting. I saw some videos. There was a kind of a cool NPR video where he talked about the debt, and part of it is they're borrowing from us bondholders,
sure,
and then paying us back. And it is part of the economy. Mm-hmm. And when you raise money, you're not just only borrowing it from other nations. You are borrowing it from American citizens who get a return on their investment, which is everything that Abigail did. She bought bonds.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of interesting to think. But I do think it's kind of wildly out of spending could be cut.
We said we wouldn't get into politics.
No, I know.
So we're going to leave that
But
one
it's
alone.
definitely interesting to think about.
It is interesting
and
to think about.
I love it when we do math.
It is a conversation to be had.
Yeah, I do love when we do conversion, today versus then
Totally.
stuff. So, well, John voted 3 times in tie-breaking votes against legislation that would harm U.S. bondholders. So there were, including his wife, all these bondholders, they were trying to fix it, but they were doing things that were going to be kind of bad for the bondholders who had, let's be real, footed the bill for the revolution
totally.
and the starting of the country. So really shouldn't be, squashing their financial prospects.
Right.
Though bond legislation that would help the situation hadn't yet passed, Abigail began compiling an inventory of her bonds through her uncle, Cotton Tufts. She requested that he acquire even more new securities in her name, but this time she wanted him to conceal her identity.
Okay.
She didn't really want people to know that the wife of the vice president was buying more bonds. Unfortunately, Tufts said that he was not able to conceal her identity, and he bought the bonds, but the receipt said, in quotes, trustee to Mrs. Abigail Adams. She was Cotton's trustee, so he bought it, but it was on her behalf. And she owned those bonds, despite the fact that officially she needed permission from her husband to have those bonds. But I don't know. He didn't see. He was like, whatever. Uncle Cotton's taking care of things.
Yeah. I also imagine John was probably just sort of like, I trust you.
She's done. Well, I mean, we already talked about how he trusted her and her import business and a lot of things.
So far, he's kind of raking in the cash from her good investments. So I think he's probably like, yeah, keep doing you.
He's been off gallivanting around Europe, having diplomatic dinners, and she's making money for the house and the family. When the new bond structure finally did pass, it split one bond into 3 new types of bonds, but each was kind of different. It had different interest rates and payment dates and things like that. Okay. So, and that happens with stocks these days. Sometimes you can have a stock that does a 2-for-1 split, and actually it ends up being good typically when that happens, I think, because then you actually have more shares.
Yeah.
I think most of the time when that happens, it's positive. Anyway, so this was positive for bondholders. Abigail's only regret was that she didn't convince John to buy more bonds. She wrote to Mary in a rare criticism of John that if she and her uncle had been left up to making decisions about the bonds, then, quote, they would have been upon a more profitable footing. In the first place, I never desired so much land unless I could have lived upon it. So John always wanted land and she wanted bonds. She's like, we don't need all this land. We can't live on it. Let me just get more bonds. The money I paid for useless land would have purchased more public securities. Well, despite the good fortune with the securities, Abigail contracted malaria that summer.
Ugh.
She said she was taken with a shaking fit, which held me 2 hours, and was succeeded by a fever which lasted till near morning. Her symptoms of malaria would flare up throughout the rest of her life. And this is the second time she's mentioned a shaking fit. So I think about when you have a fever and you start shivering. So I think that's what she means. Yeah. It's just, she's kind of saying I got all shaky and then the fever and then I was hot. And anyway, so I think that's what she meant by that. Because I wasn't sure if it was a seizure before, remember?
I've been there before, man.
Yeah.
It's awful.
In November, they had to move over to Philadelphia, where they stayed in a house called Bush Hill, where, quote, there remains neither bush nor shrub upon it, and very few trees except the pine grove. So there was a little pine grove.
That's really funny.
Since Abigail was such a seasoned traveler at this point, she settled into Philadelphia relatively easily. She had trouble finding servants again, and she went through 7 cooks in a year and a half.
Oh my gosh.
Which does make me begin to wonder, was it her? Not them?
I'd imagine so. Especially after she's traveled around, had all this food in Paris and stuff. She's probably oh, you can't cook a decent steak anymore.
Well, she was talking about them all being drunks. That was it. And
it's just that.
And so she seemed, I wouldn't call it xenophobic, but at this point she started saying immigrant workers, meaning newly immigrated from areas in Europe.
Sure.
Were not up to snuff for her, and she started favoring African Americans to anybody else as her servants. Which is interesting because I'm going to talk about it in the last episode about just overall her general attitude toward like not racist, but like slavery and abolishing slavery and like how she felt in different phases in her life. But at this point in time, she was like, wait a second, like the best workers are the African Americans and not these immigrants. And I'm just like, we're a nation of immigrants. You were an immigrant. Not really. She wasn't an immigrant, but her ancestors were.
Right.
Anyway, her schedule in Philadelphia was as follows. She had a levee on Mondays because she got smart. She used Tuesdays to prepare for a dinner that she would host on Wednesdays. She cleaned things up on Thursdays. And then she would relax and dine out with her husband on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And of course, go to church. So she kind of front loaded her week.
It's not too bad.
I think it sounds great. Right after arriving at Bush Hill, she found out that Nabby's husband had gotten a job to sail to England on a mission to borrow money in Europe to come back and buy more American government bonds. So they'd been split, so the prices had dropped a little bit. But unfortunately, by the time he got back, the bonds were so much more valuable because people were speculating in bonds that he wasn't able to act quickly enough, and the whole plan kind of didn't work.
Ugh.
I haven't gotten too much into this, but like somebody called him like a man with no trade or something, William Smith. Like he'd been a colonel in the army. He was John's secretary, but he like didn't really have any real skills. He wasn't a lawyer. Like he wasn't. So some people kind of turned their nose up at William Smith, Nabby's husband. And like, we'll see some more things that happen, but he was almost like he was like an entrepreneurial investor sort of, and sometimes it didn't work out.
Sure.
In 1791, John Quincy met a woman named Mary Fraser, and she was 16 years old and the daughter of a merchant. Mary Cranch, John, and Abigail, so his parents and his aunt, all opposed the match because they were, first of all, too young, they said, and John Quincy had only recently graduated from Harvard and hadn't established himself financially. In fact, his parents were right about that comment because they were giving him money at the time. Like he wasn't getting an income.
Gotcha.
Somewhat embarrassingly, John Quincy had actually lost his first legal case.
Uh-oh.
But don't feel bad about that because so had John Adams.
Ah, okay.
His first legal case. Both of them lost their first case. Abigail also used some of her money, in addition to giving it to her children, to help her pensioners and even her sister, who she secretly sent 5 cords of wood to via Uncle Cotton Tufts. So at the time, Richard Cranch, he was like in his 60s at this point, and he'd been a senator, and he was kind of like aging out of working, and they were just not doing that well financially. So Abigail would like, hey, Uncle Cotton, send them some wood, but don't say where it came from. Hey, Uncle Cotton, send them this. So she was trying to help out Mary, but not be overt about it, because the one other thing she did, I can't remember if I mentioned it already, like Mary and Richard had a debt to John, and she like forgave the debt to help them out.
This strangely reminds me of like back in the day, my family was super poor and our water heater broke. And my sweet Aunt Carol, she called me up specifically and was like, I'm buying you guys a water heater. Don't say anything.
A water heater is arriving. And just be like, wow.
And she was like, so let's make this happen. And I don't want to fight with your parents about it. And it was so sweet. So
I think that
I
think that kind of happened a lot. I think I talked about when Susanna was given an allowance. Abigail originally said, hey, Mary, go and like buy her some things and give them to her, but don't let her know it came from me. But then Mary was like, no, she'd actually just like to have money that she can decide what she spends it on, and it makes her feel more independent. But like there was a lot of that going on in this family.
Sure.
Okay. Well, speaking of Cotton Tufts, by the time the 1790s rolled around, Abigail, who had been the student, remember, he was like, here's how you invest. Let me do these things. She became the teacher.
Ooh.
Cotton was asking her for advice. Would it be best to sell or buy? And like all this stuff about around bond speculation. So like in their letters, you see he's like, what should I do?
Wow.
So that's kind of cool. It's like the student becomes the teacher.
The master.
The master. Unfortunately, in the spring of 1792, the bond market burst, similar to the real estate bubble in 2008, causing considerable losses. Despite this setback, Abigail again ultimately profited. Nabby's husband's bond scheme had earlier failed, and with that money, he'd actually gone to purchase lands from the state. And at this point, he was able to sell it for triple the purchase price. So he had money. He didn't buy bonds. He bought land, and so he was actually doing pretty good by a mishap.
Wow.
And in the spring of 1792, he embarked on a new venture to England, and he took Nabby and their sons with him. So Nabby was off to England for a while. At this point in her life, Abigail was 48. She had bouts of malaria and rheumatism that acted up more when she was in Philadelphia. I think we talked about Philadelphia was like hot in the summer, and it was like, "Rah." To add to it, she started going through what she called a critical period of life. Menopause.
Yes.
She ended up leaving Philadelphia because John had run up a debt of $2,000 due to the cost of living in Philadelphia and the requirement to entertain so much. Like they had to have a house, and they had to have people over, and they had to pay for all this
Parties
stuff.
and food and...
Abigail was pretty frugal, so she happily headed back home to her mansion in Braintree so that John could just move into a boarding house. And that way he wouldn't have to have any servants. And apparently a lot of government officials would do this. They just live in boarding houses, and they didn't have to keep up a house.
Makes sense.
That way they could save the money and get out of debt really quickly. In 1792, the French Revolution was occurring over in France. It was sparking divisions between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and it was raising fears of civil war for Abigail. These tensions nearly cost John his re-election, but with the anti-Adams votes split across other candidates, he secured a second term as vice president with 77 of the votes to the 50 of the runners-up.
Wow.
So he got to be VP a second time. During that summer, Philadelphia was hit by an outbreak of yellow fever. So it was really good that Abigail was back in Braintree. Also, like, her immune system was a little compromised with the rheumatism and the other stuff. 10% of the population in Philadelphia died, which was about 3,000 people.
Wow.
At the time, they didn't understand that yellow fever came from mosquitoes living in standing water. They did understand, though, that these epidemics happened in the summer months and like they could come back in the winter, but they just didn't like connect it quite yet. While in Philadelphia, John wrote to Abigail, "It seems that despite her menopause, their passions were still there." He remarked that he was as impatient to see her as he used to be 20 years before. It's like, you still got it, mama.
I mean, I don't want to be too indelicate or anything, but I'd imagine that, how can we put this mildly? It opened some doors.
Yeah.
You know? Anyway,
Yeah, I guess
we'll
that's true. If you're not, there's no risk of babies, I guess that's a different thing too. Yeah.
And that's all
I didn't think about that.
That's all we'll say.
Abigail replied, "The ravages of time will survive whilst the vital flame exists."
That's kind of rad.
Yeah.
I like it.
They had the hots for each other.
Yeah, it's great.
They'd also been together so long that they kind of had like similar thoughts. For example, Abigail had been began sending daily reports to John in Philadelphia, but before he received the first one and didn't know she was going to start doing this, he requested a similar daily account. So she was like, I'm going to start sending this. And like the letters passed in the night, and he's like, "Hey, can you send me this?" So she'd already sent it. And she said that the two of them were linked by telegraph of the mind. In September of 1794, Abigail received unexpected news from her sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth Shaw had written that her husband, Reverend Shaw, had died unexpectedly.
Oh no.
He'd spent many years drinking as well, so he died of cirrhosis or something like that.
Sure.
The last night he went up to bed and he seemed a little bit out of it. When Elizabeth went to bed later, she noticed that Shaw was breathing a bit heavily. And in the morning, she was like, "Are you ready to wake up?" And he was still alive, but he never woke up. And then he died a few hours later.
Wow.
So I don't know if he had a heart attack. We don't really know. Abigail and John took on paying for Elizabeth and Reverend Shaw's son, William's tuition to Harvard. So this is more like family taking care of family. And unfortunately, though, they had lived in the parsonage because he was a reverend, and she had to figure out a new place to live and take the younger kids. She was actually accused by some new parsons of she kind of made up stuff about like, oh, you shouldn't move in here. Like, she kind of tried to keep him from moving
There
in.
are ghosts in here.
Yeah, like kind of she made up some stuff. Anyway, so she ended up staying in the house a little longer because he hadn't been able to purchase the parsonage like her father had done the years before.
I'm straight up imagining her in a Scooby-Doo villain mask and haunting the parsonage.
She was able to make up some excuses and kind of extend her say.
I would have gotten away with the two of them, you pesky kids.
But luckily for Elizabeth, she soon married a man named Reverend Stephen Peabody. He had heard she was on the market, and he proposed. Now, she'd inherited land from her mother, Elizabeth, and she made it... she didn't... Not Elizabeth. Her mother's name was... I can't even remember. She'd inherited land from her mother.
Okay.
And she made a condition of the marriage that she would, like, maintain her own separate estate. So she emphasized her desire to secure the principal land for her children's future needs, ensuring they would benefit from it when she was no longer around. So basically, she owned land. If she married this guy, it would become his land.
Interesting.
But her kids weren't his kids. So she wanted to make sure that, like, the land that she inherited would go to her children and not to whoever he decided.
Okay.
And he said, okay, I'll sign any obligation which is reasonable. So he was like totally down with it.
Cool.
They married on December 8th, 1795, and Reverend Peabody, a teacher also, immediately enrolled Elizabeth's older daughter into his academy to make sure she received a quality education. So I think he was like a pretty good guy.
Sounds like it.
He was like a teacher. He was teaching girls and boys. He was like, sure, you can keep your land. It's all good. So it worked out for Elizabeth.
I like it.
In 1796, Washington announced that he would no longer run for a third term. Clearly, the Federalists would have John Adams as their candidate, but no one was sure who would run for the anti-Federalists, who were known as Republicans by now. The candidate turned out to be none other than Thomas Jefferson.
Tommy J.
Despite their friendship over the years, a rivalry had developed. Abigail was ready to return to her private life, but she resigned herself to the strong possibility that John could become president. She said that despite the fact that John wasn't very popular, because remember, he was kind of a curmudgeon.
Yeah.
It would not, quote, keep him out of the presidency, no matter what ordinary citizens thought. The chief of the electors would do their duty. So even though, like, the people didn't think he was the greatest, like, the electors knew. In the form of a dream, because remember, she's had a couple premonitions in the past.
Yeah.
She had a premonition on New Year's Day, and I think another one was on New Year's Day in 1797, that John would win. On February 7th, 1797, John won by 3 votes.
No way.
Sadly for John, no one from his family was able to attend his swearing in.
Whoa.
He wrote to Abigail, "It would have given me a great pleasure to have had some of my family at my inauguration."
Yeah.
Which was the most affecting and overpowering scene I ever acted in. He also wrote to Abigail, "I never wanted your advice and assistance more in my life. But why would no one be able to attend this momentous event?" Well, I'll tell you in the next and final episode. A cliffhanger!
That is a definite cliffhanger, man. I was like, and why didn't his family show up?
Yeah, you'll have to wait.
And you'll all have to wait as well, our kind listeners. Unfortunately
The
for
royal
you. The royal you. Well, wow. That was quite the saga. And I had a feeling you were going to end right when John was getting into being president. I was like, I think it's going to be...
It's like a chapter that...
Yeah.
It's the end of a chapter.
Right on.
So...
Well, I'm excited to see
life.
where it all ends up going. And I want to know why the family wasn't at the inauguration. Because it's like... It's... I can only imagine, like, his sentiment of that, too, of being like... Dude, this was one of the most intense, powerful scenes and moments of my entire life. Sure would have been nice to have some family here. It's
know.
like getting married and not having any of your family
I
there.
know.
It's like, I don't know. I mean, hey, look, if you all eloped out there and did your own thing, that's great.
I know, but if you eloped, you're at least with your spouse. He's with nobody.
I know. That's, oh, man. That's, it's like getting married without your wife. Or husband, whatever.
Yeah, your spouse, your partner,
spouse.
your person. Oh, man.
Well, cool. That was a good one.
Well,
I'm
yeah.
excited to know the rest of it.
Yeah, Royal Tyler, that guy.
Yeah. gosh.
And with a
that's
name like first name Royal with 2 L's. Royal.
It honestly does make me think of the Royal Tenenbaums with the dad, Royal, who's like a total bastard, but kind of lovable at the same time.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think Royal... well, I guess he was lovable to Elizabeth Palmer.
I would imagine that he was one of those people like Royal Tenenbaum, where it was just like, hey, he's popular for a reason. He's got friends and lovers for a reason, but he's just also happens to be a total jerk.
Well, I mean, I mentioned that he was a bit of a narcissist, and usually people like narcissists because they know how to say the right thing until they decide you're no longer of value, and then it's like, move on. Or something went wrong and they're like, oh, it wasn't my fault. But if something goes right, they're like, oh, I did it.
There we go.
I actually have a link to like someone describing the traits of narcissism.
There's a lady that keeps popping up on my TikTok that talks about narcissistic tendencies and stuff like that.
Narcissistic personality disorder. Anyway, Royal Tyler, you...
Well, wrapping it up, I guess, just really probably just one thing, one or two things really. First of all, like I always give a shout out to my friend Akiva. Anybody looking for chef's knives or general knife working or metal working needs, go check out metalworkbymiola.com, MEOLA. Use the code biographers at checkout. You're going to get 10% off your order. And then lastly, I've thought about it, and I think we've been really irresponsible towards the end of our episodes about saying if anybody does have any questions or feedback or corrections, you can shoot us an email at thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com. Always want to hear from y'all if you hear something that you go, nope, that's not true, and here's how I know this or something. Let us know. Always want to know more knowledge. We're not trying to claim to be the ultimate authority here. So
that's why I always say the Biographers Podcast, because it's our email.
I know. And it makes sense. But
well, I mean, the Biographers just was taken.
That's exactly. So we just put podcast in there. Well, I think it's probably going to do it. Anything else, Aubrey?
I think that's it. Thanks for tuning in, folks.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Hasta luego.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.